So welcome to Cure-HHT's webinar on the nuts and bolts of a clinical trial, the PATH-HHT Study. Research is the key to your future. According to Dr. Christopher Hughes, chair of the Cure-HHT North American Science and Medical Advisory Council, diseases can only be cured when scientists understand them. This understanding, which comes from basic research, leads to new drugs and treatments. Tonight's webinar will talk about the importance of clinical trials for the future of HHT and highlight the PATH-HHT study currently underway at 10 HHT Centers of Excellence. But before we begin, I want to mention that the second International HHT Guidelines for Global Standardized Care and Treatment of HHT was published in the Annals of Medicine in September of 2020. Cure-HHT created fact sheets for each topic area covered in the guidelines, along with the guideline recommendations, all of which have been bound in this comprehensive guide, which is hard to get on the screen, called Comprehensive Guide for Managing Your HHT. We're providing the first copy of this guide complimentary to all patients and providers. If you haven't received your copy yet, but would like one, please complete the Join Us form on our website. I'll post the link in the chat box once we begin. So let's get started. I'd like to introduce our speakers. Dr. Vivek Iyer is the director of the HHT Center of Excellence at Mayo Clinic and the local site principal investigator for the PATH-HHT study. His clinical interests focus on pulmonary vascular diseases such as HHT, HPS, and POPH, and airway disorders like chronic cough, asthma, vocal cord dysfunction. Dr. Iyer also practices critical care medicine. Our second speaker, Dr. Keith McCrae, is the principal investigator for the PATH-HHT study at the Cleveland Clinic HHT Center of Excellence. His interests are in bleeding, thrombotic and immune, hematologic and vascular disorders. In addition to his clinical practice and clinical trials, Dr. McCrae oversees a basic research laboratory where he studies blood and blood vessel function. And a special member of our panel today is Karen Andrews. Karen lives in Burlington, Iowa, and was formally diagnosed with HHT in 2008. She has joined us today to talk about her participation in the PATH-HHT clinical trial taking place at the Mayo Clinic. At the end of the presentation, all three panelists will be available to answer your questions. So while Dr. Iyer puts on his video and sets up his slides, we are going to launch our first poll for the evening. And the question is, what would prevent you from entering a clinical trial for HHT? And you can choose as many answers as apply to you. And you can vote now. Just give it a few more seconds. And we're going to end the poll and share the results. Dr. Iyer, would you like to speak to these results?
Yeah, so thank you so much, Nicole. So yeah, interesting answer. So the question was, what would prevent you from entering a clinical trial for HHT? And it seems like cost of travel kind of was the most important factor kind of prohibiting or hindering patients' participation in trials, and also more frequent visits also seem to be an important factor. Yeah, so that's very good information. So thank you so much, Nicole. I want to wish everyone a very good afternoon on this, what at least is a bright and sunny evening in Minnesota. It may be good morning or midnight for someone in other parts of the world, and I really want to welcome everyone to this webinar, and I really thank you for all your interest. I want to thank Nicole, Kathleen, Marianne, and everyone else at Cure HHT for their incredible dedication in moving the science forward for all HHT patients worldwide. I want to thank Dr. McCrae, who has been really the real reason why we have this trial in function. And I want to thank Karen Andrews, whom I've had the honor of taking care of at Mayo Clinic, and she will speak at the end of this talk. So with that introduction, I will get on with the business of this presentation. So what we're going to be talking about today is in two parts. I have divided this into an overview of what a clinical trial is. We'll talk about types of clinical trial designs and phases of a clinical trial. And then Dr. McCrae will take over and discuss more about the background of how the PATH-HHT trial came about. And this was based on his pilot data at the Cleveland Clinic, where he studied pomalidomide in a few HHT patients with very encouraging results. He will talk more about how the PATH-HHT trial design came about what the current status is, how many patients we have recruited, and how many more we actually need to successfully complete this trial. And then we'll answer some questions from you, and he will also give you some idea of why it is so important that all of us take clinical trials seriously. So this is a busy slide. I'll walk you through what the NIH, the National Institutes of Health in the USA, considers to be a clinical trial. So their definition is a research study in which one or more human subjects are prospectively assigned to one or more interventions, which may include placebo or other control, to evaluate the effects of those interventions on health-related biomedical or behavioral outcomes. So that's a mouthful, but basically what the definition says is, if a human being is assigned an intervention, so if you're doing something to someone to study some outcomes, then that is considered to be a clinical trial. As you can see that the NIH has, there's a number of different types of clinical trials. You can see there's mechanistic. These are studies in which we try to understand how a drug or an intervention actually works. In the PATH-HHT trial, we do have a mechanistic arm in which we are collecting blood samples before, during, and after the study, trying to understand how pomalidomide affects bleeding-related biological pathways. We have other types of clinical studies like exploratory, pilot or feasibility studies, interventional studies, and behavioral studies. Some of these words are easy to understand. We would consider the PATH-HHT trial as being an interventional study with a mechanistic arm. So that's how we would define the PATH-HHT study. It's not exactly a pilot study because we already have pilot data and we have moved that into a much bigger randomized control trial. At the bottom of the screen, there are 4 questions which you can ask to understand if this is just a clinical study or a clinical trial. And it's the same questions that are in the definition, which is, does the study involve human participants? If the answer is yes, are the participants prospectively just means going forward, prospectively assigned to an intervention? If the answer is yes, is the study designed to evaluate the effect of an intervention on the participants? And finally, is the effect being evaluated on a disease-related biomedical or behavioral outcome? So basically, if you're giving an intervention to someone to look at outcomes, then that would be considered a clinical trial. So I hope that is clear. As you can imagine, there are different types of clinical trials. I've divided this into two boxes. The top box is the observational or the non-experimental. What this basically means is we're not really doing anything prospectively. We're not giving an intervention to patients, but we're just observing what's already happened, or we are just walking along with the patients in time and seeing what happens to them. So case reports and case series are typically retrospective. So we just say, okay, this is what happened to a patient or a group of patients, and we report on them. Cross-sectional is we look along a survey of patients and see what's happening. Case control is a type of study in which we take patients with the disease and try to match them with patients without a disease and see what differences we can find. Prospective or observational cohorts are basically, we just say, okay, if you have HHT, let's just watch what happens to you over the next year or 2 years. And we try to understand how this disease evolves over time, or what interventions are needed, and how we can kind of assign whether, let's say, for example, smoking worsens bleeding in HHT patients, or whether ENT cauterization improves bleeding. So we don't assign an exposure or outcomes, but we just keep watching what happens. In the clinical trial, which is the bottom box, we can see that this is an experiment. So we're actually giving something to patients, and we're just not passively watching them. So we're actively giving something to patients. These can be single-arm studies where everyone gets an intervention. This can be a randomized clinical trial, which is what the PATH-HHT study is. You can have multiple variations of some of these designs. And basically, a clinical trial is something where you assign the exposure or the intervention, and then you observe what happens after you have given that exposure or intervention. And as mentioned, the PATH-HHT would be a randomized clinical trial. So this is a nice figure where you can understand the different types of a design. So the top figure is what we call a parallel arm study. So this is what the PATH-HHT study is. You are randomly assigned, or you can be randomly assigned to one of two paths. You either get a drug or you don't get a drug, or you maybe get one dose of a drug and a second dose of a drug. And then you just kind of go along over time, and you don't necessarily have any other intervention planned. So either you get the intervention or you don't. In a crossover, you can have two phases of the study. In the first phase, the folks in one arm get the intervention or the drug. The folks in the other arm don't, or get a different dose, whatever may be the intervention. And then they kind of cross over. So the people who didn't get the drug in the first half will get the drug in the second half, and the people who got the drug in the first half will get a placebo in the second half. So you can see that there's many different ways of designing these trials, and Dr. McCrae will talk more about why the parallel phase, parallel type of study design was chosen for the PATH-HHT study. Again, a busy slide, but basically on the vertical columns, you have the different type of studies. As you can see, cross-sectional, case control, cohort. As you remember, all of these are non-interventional studies. These are just things that we watch and observe. And the last column is RCT, which is a randomized clinical trial where patients are randomly assigned. You can think of it as a flip of a coin somewhere in a dark room. And if it's heads, they get something. If it's tails, they get some other intervention. So that's totally random. We don't have any control over whether patients get intervention or placebo. On the rows, you can see that if you want to prove causality, proving causality means, does this drug work or not? If you want to prove whether something does improve patients' lives, then the best study design is a randomized clinical trial. This is what we call grade A evidence. So when we ask the FDA to approve a drug or an intervention, if we ask a society to approve something, if we ask insurance companies to pay for a drug, if they look at a randomized clinical trial like the PATH-HHT study, and if you're able to show that pomalidomide is effective in treating HHT-related bleeding, This is given higher importance, the highest importance actually in medicine, and over any other type of study design. Even if you have 1,000 patients in a cross-sectional study, or 10,000 patients in a case control study, if we can get 200 patients in a randomized study, like the PATH-HHT study, and show something is working, that is highly, highly scientifically valid. So to prove causality or to prove effectiveness, something like the PATH-HHT study is invaluable. This is a busy slide. I'll again just walk you through it. And this just tries to help you understand that even in randomized clinical trials, the drug under investigation has to go through many phases. For example, phase 1, as you can imagine, is the earliest phase, where we're simply asking the question, is this even safe for humans? What is the minimum dosage we can give? What is the maximum dosage we can give? Typically given to healthy subjects, healthy volunteers, and we're asking whether they can tolerate this medication and whether we find any unusual or unexpected side effects. About 2/3 of these phase 1 studies proceed to phase 2. About 1/3 kind of drop out because of unexpected side effects or just intolerance to the drug, etc. In phase 2, we are trying to ask the question, we've already tried to understand the minimum and maybe maximum dosages that are potentially allowable to a human being. But in phase 2, we try to narrow that down and ask the question, what doses can we give? And if we increase or decrease the dose, does that have a better or a worse effect on the condition that we are studying? And this can typically be tens to hundreds of patients. And these last much longer depending on the study that you're studying, the disease that you're studying. Phase 2 tends to be another choke point where a lot of drugs get eliminated, either because they're not effective or they cause too many side effects, or maybe the dose where they're effective is just too toxic for patients to take. Any number of reasons. It causes liver toxicity or kidney toxicity or bone marrow toxicity. So phase 2 is kind of, it almost culls a lot of drugs out. About 1/3 of the phase 2 goes to phase 3. This is the phase which is often used by drug companies and device manufacturers, et cetera, to ask the FDA for approval. So these type of studies are designed in close collaboration with the FDA. The FDA gives input, do this, don't do that, study this endpoint, take away that endpoint, that kind of stuff. So this is done in collaboration with the FDA. And this is typically larger studies, and some of the cardiology studies have tens of thousands of patients across multiple countries and continents. These are longer term studies designed to exactly help us understand what is the precise effect of this drug on the outcome. For example, what is the precise effect of pomalidomide on bleeding? So the PATH-HHT study is somewhere in the phase 2, phase 3 realm, because this was done in close collaboration with the FDA, and it is designed to precisely answer the question about the effect of pomalidomide on helping patients with HHT-related bleeding. Phase 4 is typically after drugs are approved. These are called post-marketing surveys or analysis, and this is typically the FDA mandates drug manufacturers to collect information after a drug is out there in the market or a device is out there in the market to kind of get more information about safety and efficacy and to kind of weed out unexpected side effects. A very common, a very relevant phase 4 is this understanding that maybe some of the COVID vaccines have some rare problems with blood clots. Now, the studies themselves would have never found out that because the studies were limited to 5,000-10,000 subjects. Phase 4 is when you start getting data back from hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people who've got the vaccine, and now you start picking up these rare side effects that you may not have picked up in a smaller or even a larger clinical trial. So those are kind of the phases of a clinical trial. So shifting gears, and this is really, really exciting. I'm very happy to start talking about this trial. This has really been close to my heart. This is the first large randomized oral drug trial in HHT. And I can't emphasize how important this is for our community. So I just want to give a brief overview before handing it over to Dr. McCrae. So this is an American-based trial. This is actively enrolling. As you can see, we really tried to spread it across the country to HHT Centers of Excellence. Dr. McCrae at the Cleveland Clinic is the principal investigator, and as you can see, there's multiple red dots all over the map, which are active sites, and some of the yellowish orange dots are prospective sites that are going to be up and coming and going to start enrolling. So we have screened, as you can see, more than 1,400 patients, and about 36 have been randomized so far. So with that overview, I will now hand it over to Dr. McCrae.
And while Dr. McCrae brings up his camera, we're going to do a second poll. And the question is, what would be a worthwhile goal to you for entering a clinical trial for HHT? And you can choose as many as apply to you. If you want to go ahead and start. Okay, we're going to end the poll and share our results. Dr. McCrae, if you'd like to speak towards these results.
Well, thank you, Nicole. This is quite interesting. All of these endpoints would represent improvements in HHT symptoms for most patients. And it looks like nosebleed frequency and nosebleed duration are the two things that people are most interested in. If you could reduce your nosebleed frequency by half, or the durations of your nosebleeds by half. But also, interestingly, obviously folks would like to get rid of those iron infusions or even cut down their frequency, because all of these things, not just the nosebleeds and the unpredictability of the nosebleeds, but also the hassle of having to go in and get iron infusions on some regular basis really affects people's quality of life. And it's interesting to see this. And hopefully, if this study is successful, we will make inroads in all those things. So with that, I'd like to also thank Nicole, Kathleen, Marianne. I'd like to thank Karen for joining us tonight, and also thank Dr. Iyer for being my partner here and presenting some of this work to you. This is a effort I've put probably the last 5 or 6 years into to get to this point. And it's really been a pleasure and very rewarding to have gotten this far, but we really want to carry the football over the goal line and bring this home and hopefully show that we have found something that can really make a dent into HHT. Now, the PATH-HHT study involves pomalidomide, as shown here on the left. And as you can see, the structure of pomalidomide, this is the structure of the drug. It's called a small molecule, meaning it's something you can take by mouth, and it's absorbed in the stomach and the intestines. But the structure of pomalidomide is very similar to that of thalidomide, which you may have heard of. In fact, if you take that circular group on the right side of thalidomide and flip it 180 degrees, it'll look almost exactly like pomalidomide, except for one NH2 that's also on pomalidomide. Now, really, when Dr. Iyer showed us the importance of the different stages and steps in developing a clinical trial. But there's actually a lot of steps even before you get to the clinical trial in terms of getting the funding for a clinical trial, proving to a funding agency the feasibility for the clinical trial. And in order to do that, you have to have some data and some hypothesis to convince the funding agency, which in the case of the PATH-HHT trial is the National Institute of Health, which is about as rigorous a reviewer as you can find of the value of your study. And so in developing the pomalidomide story, pomalidomide trial, PATH-HHT trial, we fell back to thalidomide to some extent. Next slide. Next slide. There we go. So actually, before even introducing this slide to you, I'll tell you a story about what got me interested in this. About 13 years ago, I saw a handful of patients, and one patient in particular comes to mind. This patient was about a 45-year-old man who happened to have von Willebrand disease, which is a bleeding disorder. I see patients with bleeding disorders. So this is an inherited bleeding disorder in which he lacks a coagulation factor to help blood clot. But in addition to being unfortunate enough to have von Willebrand disease, he also had pretty significant HHT, though it actually hadn't been diagnosed as such at the time. And when this patient came to me, he was receiving 2 to 3 units of blood per week, as well as 2 to 3 infusions of specialized clotting factor for his von Willebrand disease, for a net bill of about $40,000 to $50,000 per week, just of blood products. And he had been told by his doctors, we can't keep this up. He had both nosebleeds and intestinal bleeding. And he was told by his doctors, we have to do something. We have to surgically remove your intestine, because we think a lot of your bleeding is coming from there. And he obviously didn't want that to happen, as none of us would. And I went to the literature, medical literature, and at that point I found 1 or 2 case reports of using thalidomide in HHT. And so I said, well, we have nothing to lose here. There's really no effective therapy. Let's give this a try. And I started him on some thalidomide, and within about 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, his bleeding had completely stopped. Completely stopped. He was getting no more blood transfusions. It's one of those things that in your medical career, you only see a few times, and it's just kind of an aha moment. And I said, someday I have to figure this out and we need to study this. And so I treated several other patients with thalidomide. They all did pretty well. And then we got to the point, I couldn't get it approved any longer by insurance. Insurance has cracked down quite a bit on things over the years. So I said, well, let's do a study. And I originally had wanted to do a study with thalidomide, but wasn't able to get the company to approve the pilot study. But I did talk them into pomalidomide, which has many similar characteristics, but actually fewer side effects. And after initiating that idea, actually, this study came out with thalidomide. This was from Italy by Invernizzi, and they had reported on 31 patients with HHT. They looked at epistaxis, nosebleeds. And if you look at the bottom left of this slide, you can see their scoring system for nosebleeds. So a grade 1 is less than an episode per week. The intensity is slight changes, slight stains on the handkerchief. Duration is less than 10 minutes. A grade 2 would be at least 1 episode a week. Intensity would be a soaked handkerchief, and the duration would be 10 to 30 minutes, and so on and so forth. The grade 0 is actually no bleeding. So they started patients on thalidomide. The dosing is shown here. And they treated them until they achieved a complete remission or a partial remission, and then they stopped and saw how the patients did. And you can see the results. I think they're best shown in the graphs in the upper right. So if you look at those graphs, those represent on the top the frequency, the middle the intensity, and the bottom graph the duration. And as you can see, the red represents a very small text, I'm sorry, but the red represents a stage 3. So that's the percentage of patients with a severe frequency, severe intensity, or grade 3 duration. And as you can see, as you move from left to right on each of these charts, that the amount of red goes down dramatically. The amount of yellow or white even, meaning a grade 1 or 0, goes up dramatically. So essentially all of these patients responded actually. They had responses in all 31 patients. Well, I'm sorry, 28 of 31, but a couple others had partial responses. So it was a very rewarding study. 28 of 31 patients responded to this treatment, which is quite remarkable. And then in the graph on the bottom right, you can see how many of those patients remained in a remission over time. So even 12 months after stopping the thalidomide, there were still 25% of the patients in remission. At 6 months, it was around 60%. So this was with 6 months of no additional drugs. So this tells you that thalidomide worked, and it worked. And not only did it work, but it also seemed to have a stable effect, at least for some period of time, on nose bleeding. Next slide. Now, another very interesting study, this is a little bit complicated and gets a little bit deeper into science, so I'm going to just go through it quickly, but this was a study published in a journal called Nature Medicine, which is one of the best and most highly respected medical journals out there. It was a very small study. They actually treated only about 7 patients with thalidomide, a few with placebo. And most of the patients treated with thalidomide had quite a nice response. But interestingly, this study took it one step further to try to show why thalidomide worked, because we don't really know how it worked. And if you look at this panel in the bottom right, what you see basically is a biopsy of the inside of the nose done on 4 patients. Subjects 8, 9, and 10 had been treated with placebo. And the green circles you see there are the outlines of their blood vessels, which were actually stained with a certain antibody that marks the amount of muscle around a blood vessel, because all muscles are surrounded by blood vessels. The muscle helps the blood vessel be strong, keeps it from breaking and opening up and causing bleeding. And one of the problems in HHT is that the blood vessels don't form right. It's not just that there's more blood vessels formed, it's that the blood vessels that are formed are not healthy blood vessels. And the blood vessels and the smooth muscle cells, the muscle cells around them, don't talk to each other properly. So if you look at the bottom right of that panel, you see that the blood vessels there, as shown by the red arrow, look much different. They're bigger, they're thicker. And what you're seeing is that a whole level of muscle cells has surrounded the blood vessels. If you look very closely toward the center of those blood vessels, you can see a little red slit. And basically that is the inside of the blood vessel. But it's now supported by a very strong and thick layer of smooth muscle cells, meaning that these blood vessels are healthier and they're less likely to break open or burst because they're now supported by muscle. Next slide, please. So based on what I've told you so far, we put together what I refer to as the pomalidomide pilot study. Now, I did a little bit of talking to pharmaceutical companies, particularly Celgene, who makes thalidomide and pomalidomide. And I said, look, this is an interesting idea I have. You have the medications I want to use. Would you consider giving me pomalidomide for free and also giving me some money to do a clinical trial? So this was a bit of a big step. Pomalidomide was an approved drug, but it's not approved for HHT. It was actually approved for multiple myeloma. But given its similarity to thalidomide, I thought that this was a reasonable thing to look at. And after writing them a proposal, they reviewed it and they approved it. And they gave us enough money to do about 7 patients. And I designed this trial, which was actually a very good learning experience for me because I put in a lot of things there I thought I could do, such as endoscopy and things like that, which turned out not to be practical, and we didn't do them. We also had a very slow dose escalation study. So if you look in the second sort of bracket there, we started pomalidomide at 1 milligram per day, and then we increased the dose by 1 milligram per month, just to make sure it was well tolerated. When we hit 5 milligrams, which is actually above the FDA suggested dose for myeloma, we kept the patient on it for another 4 months, and then we tapered it down by 1 milligram per month. So it turned out this was a very long study. It took a lot of time to accumulate this data. So not the most practical study, but actually turned out to be a useful study. Next slide. Because we had 7 evaluable patients, well, actually about 7 evaluable patients, although one patient actually withdrew consent before he started because he hadn't even taken the drug yet, but he had heart disease and had a heart problem. So we decided, he decided not to go on this. We had bad luck at the start here. A second patient had only been on pomalidomide for a little less than 2 months, and he developed a tumor in his pancreas requiring surgery. This wasn't related to the drug at all, but kind of bad luck. And one patient developed a rash, which actually happens in a couple % of patients treated with with pomalidomide, thalidomide. But there were 4 evaluable patients. And you can see that we looked at the Epistaxis severity scores initially and after treatment on all of these. And they went, for example, from 5.07 to 3.66, 5.14 to 2.93, 6.86. This was a patient getting IV iron every week to only getting it about every 3 or 4 months, 6.86 to 2.25, and finally the last one, 5.5 to 2. So really, the 4 major evaluable patients all did well with this. They tolerated the drug quite well. Next slide. So that study stimulated us to try to move this forward. And we decided we would write a larger study and we would submit it to the National Institute of Health. And we wrote this study similarly to the pilot study, but a little bit different. Again, it was a single-arm clinical trial. So here, we identified the patients, we got basic laboratory tests. We believe that patients with HHT should be managed at normal iron levels as much as possible. And so we put in a 3-week waiting period to allow the patients to be repleted with iron. And then we simply followed them for 4 months with no treatment, just to see what their bleeding scores were, their epistaxis severity score, how much iron they required. And then we moved on to another 4-month phase where we put them on treatment. And our idea was to use every patient as their own control. In other words, compare their requirements for iron, blood, compare their nosebleeds over the 4 months of treatment with the previous 4 months where they were not on treatment. It seemed like a good idea to us. The comments from the NIH review are listed down below. They didn't like our internal control group, and they didn't like the open label nature of the study design. That means that the patient knows that they're getting the drug. And so they did not like this. They didn't give us a great score and sent us back to the drawing board. Next slide. So really what they were asking for is the gold standard. As Dr. Iyer mentioned earlier, this is a randomized clinical trial. And this just shows sort of the steps when you think through developing a randomized clinical trial. You start with a target population, which of course is patients with HHT, and then you need to define a study population. So a randomized trial has to have patients who have similar symptoms. At least you have to narrow it down as much as you can so you can get data that's interpretable. And we do that by adding something called eligibility criteria. And then we randomize the patients to either a standard treatment, a new treatment, which would in this case be pomalidomide, and then we just treat them and we follow their disease. Next slide. So this is what I just mentioned. For a randomized clinical trial, we need to define the study population by inclusion and exclusion criteria. Also, we do this to ensure safety. Again, the new treatment can be a fixed dose, a dose escalation. We believe that we determined a safe and effective dose on the pilot study, and so we picked a dose of 4 milligrams, which is FDA approved. And then we had to decide, well, what is acceptable as standard treatment? First of all, the patients not randomized to pomalidomide would need to get a placebo. So we had to figure out how to get a placebo made. And fortunately, Celgene was willing to do that for us at no cost, because those are very expensive. But also we wanted to allow standard of care treatment in either arm. Standard of care, though, may not exist in clinical practice. In fact, if you go to several different doctors who treat HHT, they'd all probably tell you they have a little bit different way of treating it. And there's not a true standard of care, largely because there haven't been trials that are carefully done to compare treatments. Next slide. And our study blinding, our randomization was what we call a 2-to-1 randomization, meaning that for every 3 patients randomized, 2 patients would get pomalidomide and only 1 patient would get placebo. So we try to optimize the chance of getting effective drug. And then we wanted to determine, well, what is the endpoint that we're going to measure to determine whether the drug works? And as shown in this slide, and as all of you out there probably know, HHT has many different manifestations. It's really impossible to study all of them in one trial, but the most common manifestation is nosebleeds, epistaxis. And also, there is something called an Epistaxis severity score, which has been developed and used by HHT doctors for many years, that gives us a tool to actually measure nosebleeds. If we think about trying to measure gastrointestinal bleeding, that's very hard because patients can have gastrointestinal bleeding and not really know they're bleeding unless they become anemic or have a heavy bleed. So they can lose several teaspoons, tablespoons of blood a day in their stomach or intestine and not know it. So we picked epistaxis or nosebleeds as our primary endpoint. Now that doesn't mean we exclude patients who have both nosebleeds and GI bleeds, but the things that we're really measuring are the nosebleeds. Next slide, please. And this just shows you the epistaxis severity score. For those of you who attend an HHT Center of Excellence, probably your doctors ask you these questions every time you visit. This was designed in 2010. It is a very useful system for scoring the severity of nosebleeds. It's not perfect. There is some subjectivity to it. The hardest thing is when we ask patients to say, well, what was your typical nosebleed during the past 4 weeks or the past 3 months or whatever? And it's hard to say typical because some days somebody can have a very bad nosebleed, other days just a little bit. So it forces the patient to kind of average things out. But over time, I think that all levels out. And we use this as our primary, so-called primary endpoint in the study. Next slide. And this is a really complicated looking slide, but this is the revised plan we came up with for the PATH-HHT study. So starting from the left, we screen the patient, screening labs, genetic testing, iron and transfusion history, and then we take an Epistaxis severity score with a 3-month recall. Let me just comment briefly on genetic testing. I think it's my opinion that every patient with HHT is probably in their best interest to get genetic testing. I think as we get more drugs available to treat HHT, my hope is that we can target certain types of patients with certain drugs, and it could be that certain types of mutations will respond more to certain types of interventions. So for example, if we find you have an endoglin mutation, this might be a really good drug for you. Maybe it's not if you have an ACVRL1 mutation or these different types of mutations. But if we do genetic testing, we can find that out. Now, sometimes your insurance company hasn't or won't pay for genetic testing, but we did build into our budget some extra funding to cover your costs of genetic testing if you enter the study and pass all the screening criteria. So we can pay for this. It'll be done at Ambry Genetics, who gave us a nice discount on that. So basically, after screening, if a patient is eligible, we randomize them, and they're randomized to pomalidomide 4 milligrams a day or placebo treatment, same schedule. The medications are indistinguishable. This is also called a double-blinded study because neither the patient nor the doctor who treats you knows what medication you're on. This is another basically quality control measure to make sure there's no bias in this study and that we can really learn whether this drug works or whether it doesn't work. The patients then undergo 6 4-week treatment courses, and each month we ask them about their Epistaxis severity score, we check their iron levels, their blood counts, and every 3 months, we actually do a quality of life score. We have these 3 small surveys of 6 questions each that basically questions you about different aspects of your quality of life, how nervous you are in social situations, how, HHT can be a very depressing illness, as you know. We want to know how this drug not only affects your nosebleeds, but affects how you feel, affects your outlook on life. Because if we gave you a drug that helped your nosebleeds, but it made you feel worse, we wouldn't want to use it as much. So we don't anticipate that will be a problem, but we do want to capture this. And so we submitted this back to the NIH. As you can see by the comments on the right, they liked this. They said we responded to their reviews, so the significance was high. The project management plan is solid. They liked the placebo. They liked the ESS. So we got really lucky and they said, okay, we'll give you the money. Have at it. Next slide. So these are the eligibility criteria for the PATH-HHT study. These are the criteria we need you to meet to be eligible for the study. So you have to have a clinical diagnosis of HHT. You have to be above age 18, have a platelet count above 100,000, a white blood cell count above 2.5. INRs are basically measures of clotting screening tests, and we like your INRs to be close to normal. We don't really want you to have a major underlying bleeding disorder due to something in your blood. Of course, HHT is what we're studying, but we want to separate that from things like von Willebrand disease. We want you to have an Epistaxis severity score of equal to or greater than 3 over the preceding 3 months before the study. Now, this is considered moderate epistaxis, so I think most people probably will be eligible. And then number 7 is a real critical eligibility criteria. And I put this in bold just because we've recently revised this to make this study even more user-friendly and allow more of you to be eligible. So This study, this eligibility criteria is a requirement for anemia as determined by your local laboratory and or parenteral infusion, that just means IV infusion, of at least 250 milligrams of iron, that's 1 dose of Venofer, or transfusion of 1 unit of blood over the 6 months preceding the screening visit. So the key point here that we changed really is the and or, okay? So you can have anemia and a need for transfusion or infusion, or you can have a need for infusion, but actually not be anemic as long as your epistaxis severity score is greater than 3. So if you have heavy nosebleeds and you have a very diligent doctor who gives you iron every week, and that's enough iron to keep you from having anemia, but the frequent iron infusions are still hurting your quality of life, you will still be eligible for this study. I just want to make that clear. You know, the other criteria basically have to do with the fact that, like any drug, we have to be careful of this drug in women of childbearing age, and we have to make sure that they use appropriate preventions of pregnancy and make sure we get pregnancy tests regularly to make sure that doesn't happen. Next slide. And now, as I mentioned, these are our primary and key secondary endpoints. So our primary endpoint, as I've already discussed, is a change of the epistaxis severity score from baseline to week 24. We want to see that score drop. We want to know how much it does drop. And then as other secondary, we call them secondary endpoints. These are important endpoints, though not as important as the primary. We want to know how much iron you needed during the treatment period, how many red blood cell transfusions you needed, and we want to know your change in the PROMIS. These are the quality of life scores. We call these the PROMIS scores. Satisfaction with social roles and activities. And we've also developed our own HHT specific quality of life score, which we're testing in this study. And then we're also developed a phone app that looks a lot like the Cure HHT app, but it's designed for a different purpose. And I'll show you when we will use that on the next slide. Actually, the slide after this, excuse me. But we also exclude people with certain things, and we do this primarily for safety. You know, we don't know the effect of pomalidomide on someone who's breastfeeding. We don't want to take any chances on somebody who has kidney or liver problems. We don't want to, for example, if somebody has had previous problems with blood clots, you know, we don't want to put them on this drug because it probably does have a very low risk of increasing blood clots. Now, if somebody has problems with peripheral neuropathy, in other words, numbness and tingling of their nerves for whatever reason, we don't want those patients on. Thalidomide can cause some of that. Pomalidomide, much less common, and usually only if the patients are on the medication for a long, long time. Nevertheless, we want to take no chances with your safety. This is a safe study, and we want to keep it that way. Next slide. This is what we call the schedule of events. So if you look on the left column, these are the things we're looking to measure: the epistaxis diary, the epistaxis severity score, the iron levels in blood, the quality of life, and the biospecimen. Now, the biospecimen are specimens we take and we save in the freezer to study at some point when the trial is over to try to further identify patients who seem to do better with this drug if we're able to do that. The biospecimen is optional. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, but it will greatly help us to understand how this drug works. And I'll also mention that the genetic testing is also optional. We don't force you to do that to be in the study, though we encourage it. Now, we've made a lot of changes since this study first opened, particularly due to COVID. And as you can see here, everything in gray are studies that can be done virtually. At the beginning, we required all these to be face-to-face. but we brought this up with the FDA, with the IRB, and we got permission to do all of these grade-in studies virtually. So essentially, you only need to see us face-to-face at the baseline randomization study, and you need to see us back at the end of cycle 6, after the 6 months of treatment. Now, we do still require you to do a virtual visit with us. That doesn't have to be on a computer on Zoom. It can just be by phone or whatever works. And we do require you to get some blood tests. We do have to test your blood every month. But you can do that in a local lab near to home. So really, I think this makes this much easier for you to do, requiring only 2 visits. And I also want to point out that, particularly since some of our earlier questions showed that travel costs were a limiter to participating in a study like this, travel funding is available for patients who live at a distance from a study site. And that's been provided by a very generous donor to Cure HHT. So we can help you apply to that. Nicole can help you with that. And you can get funding if you need it for your travel, for your hotel stay, if that's necessary for whatever you need to come to this study. So we've really, really, really tried to make this study easy for you. Let me just mention again here the Epistaxis diary. That's shown in the blue horizontal bars. This is an app that we've actually written that goes in your phone, and we want to actually record the total duration of your nosebleeds over these 4-week periods throughout the study. So at the end of the day, you can just go into that app, you press a couple things, and it tells, to put in how many minutes you think you had of nosebleeding that day. And then we can compare that throughout the study. If you're uncomfortable with apps or don't like playing with cell phones, we're happy to give you a paper copy, and you can do that also. Next slide. Here's where we are as of April 8th. The gray line shows the amount of patients that the NIH expected us to be on study. The blue line shows where we actually are. We've bumped up a bit since April 8th, but we're still behind where we need to be. As you can see, particularly from November of 19, when our first sites opened, to May of 2020, we did very poorly. And this was because this was the onset of COVID. There was a lot of panic. Appropriately so. A lot of sites shut down their clinical trials for the time being. We really fell behind, and gradually we've kind of picked it back up since then, but we still have some significant catching up to do. And let me just put in my own comment. I think, as I said, we've tried to reduce your trips to visit us. Some people are still probably scared of coming to a hospital when there's still COVID around, and I understand that. Frankly, I think hospitals, as long as you're not in the COVID ward, are probably some of the safer places you can be. Our hospital, and most hospitals I'm aware of, still screens people at the door. They check your temperature. They require you to wear a mask. They ask you many questions that I've been asked myself now about 1,000 times about whether I've been exposed to anybody with COVID. So I think hospitals, as long as you're not right in with the COVID patients, are actually quite safe places to be. But despite that, you only have to come twice to the site. Next slide. These just show the sites that are involved and how many they've enrolled so far. Mass General is doing really well. They're leading us. Dr. Iyer at Mayo is doing really well. University of North Carolina doing well. Cleveland Clinic itself, we're a bit behind, but we have 2 or 3 people ready to enter, so hopefully we'll be catching up. And as I said, we plan to bring on about 5 more sites, hopefully soon. Next slide. So what happens after a patient completes the PATH-HHT trial? What if they got stuck with the placebo? They didn't really improve. They say, shoot, I spent 6 months on that dumb placebo. I got nothing for it. Well, you didn't really get nothing for it. You actually really contributed to this study and to the knowledge. But Celgene has agreed to provide pomalidomide to patients for those who want to continue, either patients who responded to it or patients who who got placebo and obviously kept bleeding, this will not be under the guidance of the study itself. It's independent of the study. But if your HHT physician would like to keep you going on this, and you would like to go on this, and your insurance company will not pay for pomalidomide, Celgene will supply it to you without cost. Next slide. So I'm just wrapping up here. Why would you want to participate in a clinical trial? Well, first of all, they're safe, they're free. This doesn't cost you anything. The drug is free, the care is free, and you get really good clinical care in a clinical trial. You will advance knowledge of HHT and its treatment for you and for family members and for children and generations to follow. This trial provides the strongest evidence for treatment effects, as Dr. Iyer mentioned. It can form the basis for clinical and public health policy, including potentially approval of this drug by insurance companies for payment. Access to novel interventions not otherwise available, such as pomalidomide. I will also say you are not locked into this. We don't put you in a place and say, you're going to take this for 6 months. If for any reason you say, well, I don't feel very good on this treatment, or my nosebleeds are getting worse, or whatever. I mean, you won't know whether you're on placebo or drug, but you are always welcome in any clinical trial to drop out at any time. Of course, we don't want you to, because it helps us to complete the trial and gather the data if you stay through it. But if for some reason you need to drop out, you can drop out. If for some reason your nosebleeds are really bad and you want to see your ENT doctor and get a vessel cauterized, you can do that. We just record it. We don't prevent you from getting any appropriate care that you need. And I've already mentioned the clinical trials may help family members and others. Next slide. So that is it. And again, I thank everyone for your attention. I thank everybody for hanging on through this. And I'm going to turn it back over to Nicole.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, that was incredibly informative. And I know we're going to have a lot of questions. But before we get to that, I want to bring up our last poll as Karen Andrews turns on her camera. And also, I want to let you know that I realize that we are at the 7 o'clock hour, but I'm sure that our speakers will be able to stay on longer so that we can have some Q&A time. So hold tight and we will get to your questions very shortly. So the third poll says, have any of the following affected your interest in the PATH-HHT trial? Choose all that apply. And you can begin. Give it just another second or two. Dr. Iyer, would you like to address this and to introduce Karen?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nicole. So basically, I think this is a fascinating spread of answers. Obviously, the most important, and I think this thing that might give us the most bang for our buck, is this answer number 4, which says, I have not visited an HHT center and my local doctors are not aware of this trial. So that is an enormous opportunity for you to go to the Cure HHT website and figure out what your nearest HHT Center of Excellence is and the nearest trial location, and first visit with an HHT doctor, figure out what's going on, and then see if this trial may be something of benefit to you. Number one is also something I guess we can all as a community improve on. It says, my HHT doctor has not told me about it. I am hoping if you were at a center of excellence and if that center was participating in this trial, that they would have had at least a discussion about potential options for your bleeding. So that's definitely something that we as a community can improve on. I am worried about getting a new treatment without knowing more. Trust me, this is not unusual. If I were in your place, if I was on the other end of this, trying to sign up for a clinical trial, I would have exactly the same apprehensions. But like Dr. McCrae and I went through, to reach this phase in the PATH-HHT trial, it means it's gone through layers and layers and layers of safety concerns. The FDA is involved. We have monitoring in place. Pomalidomide as a drug has been available on the market for more than a decade or more. So there's multiple things about this trial. It's not a brand new drug, it's an established drug. We know what we're dealing with. So that should allay some of your concerns about this. And I think the last answer was, my HHT doctor has suggested I don't need this treatment given my current state, and that's fine. This might mean that your bleeding is not severe enough, or there are other forms of treatment that may have worked for you and prevented bleeding. So that is great. But you being part of this webinar hopefully has enlarged your knowledge base about this trial and about clinical trials in HHT in general. So with that, I want to introduce Karen. Karen lives one state south of me in the great state of Iowa. She and I met for the first time in July of 2020. And Karen is like the perfect patient for a clinical trial because she and her husband, the first thing they said is, how can we help move this forward? How can we help? And part of being in a trial is, how does this trial help me? And part of this is also, it might never help me, but it will help everyone that comes after me. And that's really where Karen and her husband's heart was, is I don't know if this is going to help me, but I'm going to enroll in this so that everyone that comes after me can have the knowledge that this drug is effective or not. Karen, unfortunately, does have HHT and has been bleeding or had bled for more than 30 years. And over her life, she'd had more than 50 blood transfusions before July of 2020. She'd had about 6 or so nasal cauterization procedures in 2018, 19, and 20. And so when she came to me, she was in quite a tough spot. So with that introduction, Karen, over to you.
And I want to thank everybody at the Mayo Clinic, Dr. Iyer, Sue, Dr. Chobe, Dr. Planch, that have just pushed me forward and held me up so that I could complete this trial. It's been a wonderful, wonderful experience. Being a third generation HHT person, yes, my heart was in the path of maybe I'm not passing this condition forward, but who else can benefit from it? And if everybody seeks out that kind of attitude, it won't take long, and you can watch your children and benefit and have quality of life by the polyumidaride. It has shortened the duration of my nosebleeds from, I would have them an hour twice a day down to maybe 15 minutes. And the gushing down to just dripping. I can't tell you what a difference this trial has made in my life. When you both spoke of quality of life and being able to actually look forward to things, plan things, to look forward to the future, things like graduations for my nieces and nephews, things maybe that are not very far down the road, that I was in a state where it was, am I going to be able to participate in that? Feel comfortable in participating? Will it be indoors? Will it be outdoors? Will I have access to a bathroom? All those things that just restrict your life so much with the HHT. And those burdens were lifted, totally lifted. So I can't encourage people enough. I got to watch my grandmother and my father with this condition, and there was no, I know my father got to the point where there was nothing for him to try, and it was like he gave up because there was nowhere left to turn. And I'm just so happy for all the hard work and everyone at the Cure HHT for putting this on this evening, giving me an opportunity to share my story, and hopefully to encourage people to get to their nearest center and to seek out that help, because it will change your life. Absolutely.
Well, Karen, thank you so much for that testimonial. It's truly from the heart, and obviously your family's been very impacted by HHT, and we just really appreciate you being here tonight. And if Dr. Iyer and Dr. McCrae want to turn your cameras on, I also want to just thank you for your exceptional presentation of both clinical trials. I think you made that very understandable, and it's something that is typically way over all of our heads. And just to give a really thorough overview of the PATH-HHT study, because I do think a lot of people will benefit from trying to learn more, connecting with a center. So let's get to our questions, because I know we're staying on a little bit late, but people are hanging in there. So the first question is coming from Nikki, and she's asking, I don't have nosebleeds at all, but have to get iron infusions frequently. Is this study only for people with nosebleeds?
Well, I can take that one. Thank you. Thanks for that question. You know, unfortunately, this is, you can have GI bleeding and be in the study, but you also have to have nosebleeds. And that's unfortunate, but it's because we, in order to prove that this drug works, we have to have something we can measure accurately and easily. And we can do that with nosebleeds, but there's, unlike the Epistaxis severity score, there's no corresponding score for GI bleeding. It's very difficult to quantify. So we were not able to, we actually tried to include that in our first proposal to the NIH, but they didn't like the fact that we didn't have a good measurement system. So we had to sort of streamline it just to focus on nosebleeds. So if you have nosebleeds and GI bleeding, you can participate, but GI bleeding alone, you probably wouldn't be eligible. That said, if this trial is successful, and I certainly hope many people have the experience Karen has had, and you know, we show randomized data that show it works, I would hope that someday this drug could be available to you for treatment just by a prescription.
Well, and along those lines, I do have, Jennifer has asked, patients with GI bleeding with minimal nosebleeds would not be eligible for this study. Is that correct? So I guess the word minimal here is kind of the question to what, you know, you're just responded to.
Yeah, I'll follow up with that since I took, you know, but I guess, yeah, minimal is the $64 million question here. So if your Epistaxis severity score is 3, which is not by any means a severe nosebleed, it's almost in the mild to moderate range. So, you know, you could potentially be eligible, and the only way to know for sure would to be, you know, see your HHT doctor and sort of ask them to do the Epistaxis severity score. with you just to see what it comes to be. And if it's 3 or higher, you still could be eligible. Or yeah, I mean, if it's 3 or higher, and you could still definitely be eligible.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that. So Karen, this question is for you, and just asking, why did you decide to participate in the PATH-HHT study? I mean, you mentioned all about your family. I think people are thinking, wondering more from just taking the risk of getting a placebo versus drug.
Well, for me personally, I wasn't super concerned whether I got a placebo or not. It basically came down to quality of life. My life had gotten to be such a yo-yo that it was worth taking the chance at that, and to help people, to know that I could be helping somebody else's father or grandmother. Like I said, watching my dad not have anywhere to turn and nothing to try, that is the biggest hopelessness I ever had to watch. He was like, I can't fight anymore. And if somebody didn't try something, then where would we be? So I was all on board.
Well, great. Well, we're very appreciative of that for sure. So we have had a couple of people ask, what is in a placebo, and why do clinical trials have the placebo, especially if someone needs a medical intervention for their symptoms?
I can take that, Keith, if you wish.
Sure.
So that's a fascinating and a fantastic question. And it comes down to this. Human beings respond differently when something is done to you versus not done to you. And this has been noted in many, many, many diseases. So if I bring you to the clinic and I give you, let's say you have asthma, and I give you a nebulization, but I don't tell you that all I've put in the nebulization is salt water or just distilled water. At the end, and there have been studies done of this, so at the end of the nebulization, asthma patients will say, oh, I'm doing great. I feel so much better, doc. Thank you so much for giving this medication to me. So the very fact that we are doing something gets patients to have an internal, especially if they trust the physician and they have a excellent relationship, something that is done to them elicits a positive response. So if I say to Karen, for example, here's this medication, tell me what your quality of life is in 2 weeks. And if Karen believes that this is the real medication, then she's going to say, she might say, yeah, I'm actually feeling better, because the mind tends to process information differently when something is being done versus nothing is being done. If I just tell Karen, come back in 2 weeks and let's talk and tell me what your quality of life is, she'll be like, Dr. Iyer did nothing for me. I'm actually feeling a little worse. Versus if I just gave her a sugar pill, which is what a placebo is. A placebo is basically an inert substance that is made to look exactly like the real drug. For example, in the PATH-HHT study, if I give you the placebo and the pomalidomide capsule, you will not be able to tell the difference. So the idea is to take away that human brain playing tricks on us and trying to make us feel better or not feel better. If you had just given the pomalidomide and not given anything to the other arm, the arm that got nothing would automatically, just based on our past experience, start feeling worse because, hey, they didn't do anything for me. But in this case, we have to give placebo to one group, and in PATH-HHT, 1 out of every 3 gets placebo, but 2 out of 3 get the real drug. But neither you nor us, the investigators, know whether it's the placebo or the real drug. The reason we have to compare everything to placebo is because we really want to tease out this random chance that people's disease gets better, gets worse with time. We want to take all of that away, and we want to really see whether the drug actually does better than just giving you an inert, essentially chemically neutral placebo. So I hope that answers your question. And every patient feels like, I'm going to do this. I want to get drug. I want to do better. And that would be me if I were part of it. But there's really no way of really understanding whether a drug works or not unless we take away those cognitive biases and those errors that come into how we rate our symptoms and our quality of life and our bleeding duration and things like that, unless we make everyone feel like they're getting the same intervention.
Great, thank you. Well, we have had multiple people ask the question, what are the side effects of pomalidomide?
Well,
I can take that. Oh, let Karen. Go.
Let me just say, for me personally, the side effects are good. I have a quality of life. I have less bleeding, shorter durations. My side effects are all good. Other than the drug itself, with a little bit of upset stomach, maybe some constipation, all just side effects from the drug itself. I didn't experience any other outside side effects.
Thanks, Karen. I can just add a little bit. I mean, constipation can occur in some patients. As an investigator, one thing we watch very carefully are the blood counts. And there are some patients who can get a little bit of lowering of the white blood cell count over time. And that's why we get blood counts every month. We've not had any consequences of that. Obviously, if you make a blood count go very, very low, you can be more likely to get infection, but we haven't had anybody go that low at all, and we monitor this closely. If they do go below a certain level, like 1,000, which is still quite a safe range, we generally hold the medication for a week or two, and then we can start the patient on usually on a one dose lower. So instead of 4 milligrams, 3 milligrams. I will say we don't actually know what is the minimum effective dose of this drug. So it's possible that if we go through this study and we see a good effect and this drug gets approved by insurance, patients might be able to be treated with 2 milligrams or 3 milligrams, and it might work just as good and with even fewer side effects. But those are really the things we've looked at. The low blood counts have been in about, so far, 5 or 6% of the patients we've treated.
Great, thank you so much. So we have an individual that says they're third generation HHT. They don't need transfusions, but they're on daily iron and get nosebleeds. Would they be a candidate?
I would say if you have nosebleeds and your epistaxis severity score is 3 or greater, and you have anemia, as defined by your local lab. So if your local lab cutoff is 12 and you're 11.5, you would be eligible, yes.
Okay, thank you. And Karen, this question is for you, asking, do you continue to take this medication after the trial?
Yes, I do. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and is that an easy process through Celgene directly, or is that managed through the HHT Center?
I went through the HHT and through my personal insurance. So I haven't been through the Celgene process. So
Okay.
I'm not sure what that's like. But
okay.
It really wasn't horrible difficult to do.
Okay, great. So the next question is, I'm currently on Avastin, but my iron infusions went from every 3 months to every 3 weeks. I'm bleeding like before the Avastin. How long do I have to be off Avastin before I can try this study?
I can take that. So that's a great question, because many of the patients in our study have been previous Avastin recipients, and either by choice or because maybe the Avastin was working initially and stopped working, which we are seeing in a number of patients. For one reason or another, of these 7 or 8 folks in our site, at least 2 or 3 were previously on Avastin. So this comes up quite frequently. So that's a very good question. So the answer is, if you were at least 4 weeks out from your last dose of Avastin, then you would be eligible for this trial. And what you're telling us that yes, Avastin worked, it made me feel better, but now my iron infusions haven't totally gone away, and I'm kind of somewhat better in the iron infusions, but I still need them. So this is the kind of situation where this trial would be an option for you. And all you need to be is about a month away from the last dose of Avastin.
Okay, thank you. So Victoria has asked 2 questions. She said that she's had to back out of the cleanse portion of trials before because her hemoglobin plunged without her Injectafer, Procrit, and iron pills. And so she's asking if there's a cleansing period before this trial. And also wondering if the Epistaxis diary that you mentioned, the app, if it can be utilized now or only for patients in the trial.
I can take that. I'm not quite sure I understand the cleansing part, but if what Victoria means is a run-in phase, then there is a 4-week run-in phase where we, from the date you're enrolled to the date you actually get your drug, is about a 4-week interval. Not sure if that's the question she's trying to ask, but there's a 4-week period, and then I'll have Dr. McCrae answer the question about whether the Epistaxis diary is going to be available post-trial.
Yes, thank you, Victoria. I think maybe what you mean is there a run-in period where you're not allowed to take iron? And as Dr. Iyer mentioned, there is a month between the 28 days minimum between the screening and the randomization, but you can continue to receive iron during that time. We're not going to, we're not going to take your iron away. You can definitely keep on that. And then, the app, yes. The app so far, actually, it was developed by, we have a whole separate, what we call a data coordinating center, which is in North Carolina, and they handle all the clinical data from the study. They actually wrote the app. It wasn't me. I wish I did know how to do that, but not in 100 years. But in any case, at this point, that app, I think, is really only open for people on trial, though in the future, I would hope that it becomes available to anyone.
Great, well, thank you. So we've had also a couple people ask, what happens if I don't live close to a recruiting site and I get new symptoms when I get home? Is there any kind of coordination with the local doctor?
I can take that. Absolutely. So I think the question is, if you become part of this trial, but you live ways away, what happens? So as part of the trial, actually, like Dr. McCrae mentioned, most people who enroll in a trial get better clinical care than you would get otherwise. Why? Because as Dr. McCrae put that little timeline, you can see the number of times the study interacts with you. Either someone is calling you, or you're coming in for a visit, or we're shipping you drug, or you're getting a blood test done. So there's constant monitoring one way or the other. And as part of your enrollment, you get a consent form that you sign in, which says, here's a phone number. You can call 24/7 for any problems. Here's the study coordinator's phone number. Here's the principal investigator's phone number. So you have access to the study team and your recruiting site always. And so that should not be a concern at all. And I actually feel, as part of a clinical trial, you get interaction with your team a lot more frequently and in a very structured way. So I think that even if you live far away, there should be no cause for concern about side effects, etc. And also, as Nicole probably wants to add, there is, from a generous benefactor, funding available to make those visits happen. So even if you need to come in, let's say for an unscheduled visit or for side effects or what have you, that is something that you potentially can have help available for.
Great. Well, thank you so much. So we're just going to ask, one or two more questions because I think these two are kind of indicative of what is on people's mind. One, if they don't go to an HHT center, can they participate in the trial, and how would they go about doing that?
I can take that or do, okay. So I think Dr. McCrae will agree. Running a clinical trial requires expertise, requires infrastructure, requires a lot of familiarity with the process, having previously done clinical trials, having research coordinators, etc. So when we want to get a study like this successfully completed, you have to restrict the number of sites to centers that see a lot of patients, have previously participated in trials, etc. So as of now, Dr. McCrae is expanding sites, but outside of the 10 sites and a few more that are coming up, I don't think it's going to be possible for you to visit with, let's say, your local hematologist or someone and get access to this trial. Now, that hematologist can refer you to the nearest HHT center, which would be happy to enroll you in this trial.
Yeah, I would just add that, again, you only need to see a site twice. And in the interim, as long as you continue your pomalidomide or your placebo, whatever you're assigned to, you can still get standard of care treatment from your local hematologist. You can get your blood counts done at your local hematologist's office. All those, and we're, as Dr. Iyer said, we're happy, whether you're in a trial or not in a trial, to work at least, with your local hematologist to help manage your care. So I think that's a good question.
And I guess the question also would be, if they're not going to an HHT center, they would ultimately need to come to a center to recruit into this study. And then at that point, they would become a patient of the center, right? They would go through the regular screening process and all of that.
Correct. But again, even the screening can be done virtually. There's only 2 visits required. The base, we have to, just for safety, we feel we need to just come face to face with a patient one time before we put them on a study. And then we want to just see them one time when they finish, their drug trial, just to make sure everything's fine. But yeah, those are our only, and just a reminder also that there is funding available for this travel.
Right.
I just wanted to add that I have a whole bunch of patients in the trial who live a few hundred miles away, including Karen. So these patients are continuing care with their local primary care doctors, their hematologists. They're continuing to get iron infusions. Dr. McCrae mentioned that there's really we're not asking you to stop any of your treatments. So you can keep getting, if you're getting iron infusions every week, you can keep getting that. So we're not interfering in any way with your standard of care with your local providers. We in fact want to partner with them and help them kind of manage you better.
Okay. And our last question is there a time limit on joining the study, and how do I sign up?
Well, you can, there's not really a time limit. I mean, we have our study statisticians tell us that we need, given the assumptions that we've made based on what we predict to be the efficacy of this treatment, that we're going to need 159 patients to statistically be able to say that this drug absolutely is helpful, without a shadow of a doubt. Now, we do have an interim analysis when we have about 75% of those 159 patients enrolled. And if that interim analysis shows, hey, great, this drug really works well, we may not need the whole 159, then likely the NIH will tell us, thank you for doing a great study, but our money's tight and no need to give money where it's not needed. So we hope to finish with our accrual of patients by April of 2022. We're going to need to really push and get a lot of enrollment to get there. So there is a time limit to some extent. It's not like you have to come tomorrow, but there will be a time limit at some point. And then in terms of how to enroll is just contact one of again, the website, the Cure HHT website has a link to this trial. It shows all of the centers of excellence that are participating in this trial. The website has all their contacts, their phone numbers. Just give a site a call and tell them you're interested, and they can give you the nuts and bolts on how to get enrolled.
Thank you so much for this incredible overview of the study and understanding of clinical trials. I really appreciate you staying on so much longer than we had originally planned. I think this was important to ask these kinds of questions. And so in closing for tonight, I just want to say that on behalf of everyone at Cure HHT, I want to thank you for attending tonight's webinar and for staying connected with us. Cure HHT is the only patient advocacy organization funding HHT research, providing education materials to patients and providers, advocating for the disease, and expanding treatment centers around the world. We are here for you, but we can't advance drug therapies for HHT without your participation in clinical trials. There are several HHT clinical trials listed on the Cure HHT website, with a few more to come by the end of the year. Please consider learning more about the PATH-HHT study and all clinical trials currently being conducted, sharing this information with your family members, and playing your part in advancing the cure for HHT. Remember, if you haven't received your complimentary copy of the Comprehensive Guide to Managing Your HHT, let us know by completing the short survey at the end of this webinar, and your feedback will also help us better serve you in the future. And lastly, I want to mention that if you haven't participated in the International HHT Guidelines Education Series, I strongly encourage you to watch previously recorded webinar topics on anemia, GI bleeding, and pediatrics, and to register for the remaining 5 free webinars on our website at www.curehht.org. Again, I just want to thank Dr. McCrae, Dr. Iyer, and Karen Andrews for volunteering their time this evening. This program has been recorded and will be posted on our website. We truly appreciate your participation and hope that you enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.